Okay, we are recording.
Greetings, everyone. We're glad that you were able to make it today to Darby Creek Watershed 101. Today's presentator is Garrett White from John Heinz Wildlife Refuge, and he's going to be speaking to us today about invasives and the snakehead fish. And the way we run this is that you can ask a question through chat, or you can wait till the end where we'll have open discussion. If you have any questions, please let me know. And Garrett, are you ready?
I think so.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Share screen, PowerPoint. There we go. All right, let me minimize that. All right, well, first off, thank you, Darby Creek Valley Association and Stroud for hosting this. Thank you, everybody, also for taking time out of your day to watch this presentation. Hopefully you learned a little bit something out of this if I'm doing my job correctly. So this is Invasive Species, National Invasive Species Week, all week, so there's events going on everywhere. Ideally, we'd be doing this in person somewhere, but alas, with COVID, of course, we have to do this online. So check out this website, do some other research as well. This is an image of spotted lanternfly, which is another invasive species that is currently spreading in the Northeast. So definitely do some research on that one. But today, we're going to talk about invasive species. And
Garrett, I'm sorry, you're sharing just you, not your screen.
Oh.
You have to click on your presentation.
I was seeing Garrett's screen.
Oh, really? I apologize. I'm not sure what's going on with my computer. Go ahead, continue. I'm sorry.
All right, everyone can see the table of contents, hopefully. So we're just going to go through some definitions so everyone's on the same page. We'll talk about invasive species and the process that we get there and their effects. Then we'll go into northern snakehead as an example, some of the laws and policy reflecting them in particular, and then their future actions. And then, of course, there's time at the end for questions. I can't see the chat, so we'll just hold everything until the very end. So some definitions that are important when you're talking about invasive species are what are native, what are non-native. So obviously a native is originating in a certain area or a certain region. Non-native tends to be outside of that. And then invasive, the important part about this is that it is actually a legal definition. It is a non-native to an ecosystem, and it also causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm. And it is from Executive Order 13112, which was signed back in 1999. So, I mean, it's a legal definition. Aquatic nuisance or aquatic invasive species, they're interchangeable. These are just typically the ones that are limited only to aquatic. And then noxious is another word that is used a lot in the invasive species world, or alien. A lot of these words are used interchangeably. So I'll try to use the words invasive and non-native throughout, and so now you know what I mean. So what is the process for an invasive species to become invasive? Because not every non-native species gets to that point. Well, first there has to be an initial introduction. And now whether that's accidental, whether a species came over in the ballast water of a ship, or it was carried over through transporting, shipping, something like that, or there's also, it could be intentional. There are plenty of invasive species in the United States that were even promoted for different benefits at various times, whether it was a plant or a fish, and introduced to new waterways. So there has to be an initial introduction. Now some species, then there has to be an establishment as well. So some species you can't just take from one environment and put it into another. Obviously a saltwater fish is not going to live in a freshwater environment and vice versa. So it has to be the right climate, it has to be the right habitat for a species to survive. And then you head into spread, which in that case is more reproduction. So if you just have males of a species in one area, you're never going to get any sort of spread. They'll just live their life and then that's the end of it. But if they can reproduce and spread, then they can head over to a larger area. And some species never make it to invasion. They just kind of live and they're around us and they just naturalize. They work within the ecosystem, luckily, and they never get to the point of an invasion, which is where they cause environmental or economic harm. And we'll touch on more about what that means in a little bit. So like I said, some species can fall off at any different point, whether it transports into death or captivity, it maybe doesn't establish, or it remains local. There are many different points where a species that once it gets introduced into a new environment, that it can spin out, and that's just the level of where it is. Thankfully, not every species gets all the way down to an invasive species. And then each invasive species it falls along a scale, whether it's low or high. And in some cases that it can even be based on human perception of what they think an impact is or not. Some impacts to some people, because obviously a lot more than what it could be for somebody else's. The typical timeline for an invasive species as well in different areas falls along this. So it gets introduced, and then it's a while until someone even finds it. And then when it becomes a problem, then typically the public awareness falls in. That's kind of where we are right now with northern snakehead in some areas. And then at the tail end of it, it becomes more about management and control. Obviously, the earlier you can detect invasive species along this timeline, the easier it is to maintain it. Also, the lot lower cost it takes. It's called early detection and rapid response, EDRR. It is something that we try to do, and we're always monitoring here at John Heinz and other conservationists across the country. It is something we're always monitoring. So then how does a species become invasive? Well, typically it has to have a competitive advantage for resources, whether that's water or sunlight or space. The example here is Phragmites. It's a reed that takes over salt and freshwater marshes up and down all along the country, really. And the stolons here that my refuge manager, Lamar, is holding here, this is a lovely, almost 20-year-old photo of him. He clearly does not like stolons. This is basically a root of the Phragmites. They'll grow at least 60 feet, sometimes up to 5 inches a day. You can see it crossing the water in that bottom photo there. And this plant will just take over an area because it is outcompeting other plants. It is growing faster. It can spread seeds and spread roots and just decimate ecosystems along the way. One important nutrient that we're going to talk about with northern snakehead in particular is oxygen. In low oxygen environments, they have a special adaptation and some other advantages than other species. So what are some of their impacts? Well, they reduce the abundance of native flora. When you have, say, the Phragmites in the lower left there, they'll just create a monoculture. They will completely outcompete other species, and so it's the only plant that'll live in that area. And what that does is it pushes out a lot of other species, and so you lose that biodiversity. The more biodiversity you have in an area, the more plants and animals and the healthier the ecosystem will be. And what an invasive species also does is it lowers the available resources to another animal. Whether, say, the red-eared slider, you lose that sunning spot, or just any of the food, say the rusty crayfish there in the bottom. It'll eat the food of other species and outcompete them. Or the purple loosestrife, another wetland plant in the bottom right there. There's just a lot of additional stressors, especially on an ecosystem like a freshwater tidal marsh. John Heinz is the largest remaining freshwater tidal marsh in Pennsylvania. And so any new stressor to an ecosystem like that could really set things off balance. So that's why we really try to prevent as many new invasive species as possible. For the financial cost of invasive species, it's monetary in a lot of cases. You can reduce, invasive species will reduce property values by up to 16% in some areas. The U.S. agricultural business loses over $13 billion due to damage from insects, over $19 billion due to rats across the country. In general, one report came out that it's estimated that over $120 billion in damages from invasive species across the United States. That's larger than tons and tons of industries out there. So there absolutely is a huge financial cost to invasive species, and much to be gained by preventing them. So here in the state of Pennsylvania, this is the list of aquatic invasive species and noxious species that is put out by the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission. These are legally listed, though a law was passed to list them as an aquatic invasive or noxious species. Every state has their own list, so I encourage everyone who is watching up and down the East Coast to do some research and figure out what is around them and what is in their local area. And there is a lot of crossover in between these. But today, we're going to talk about snakehead, and in particular, the northern snakehead. So the northern snakehead is a freshwater fish. It has this snake-like head and has this long anal fin that you can kind of see on the right here. I think you can see my mouse. That long anal fin here. There are scales on top of the head. Now, one of the cool things about, or one of the unique things about this fish is that it is an obligate air breather. So that means that it must breathe air. It does not breathe water like a typical fish does. It does still have gills. It is a primitive lung. So what happens is there's a special chamber. It'll gulp down the air, and then as long as the gills remain wet or moist, there is still oxygen transfer from this chamber that they breathe air into their gills. And then another rumor about them is that they can live or walk on land. It's kind of a gray area in that sense. They can kind of, if they're left on a surface, they can kind of squirm around and move a few feet, but they're not actually walking, and they don't have any sort of structures to move around in that sense. But unlike other fish, and because they can breathe air, they live a lot longer than other species would outside of the water. There's a story from the Refuge that there was a fish that was caught on a Friday, put into a freezer, and then on Monday, it was still alive. Well, the reason behind that was, one, because it can breathe air, and it was in a nice, cool freezer, that it kept the water, the moisture on the gills, it could still breathe. So it was able to live for a few days in this freezer. Also, because of the cold air, it lowered its metabolic rate, so it did not have to use any resources outside of air. So that's a little bit unique for this species. In terms of breathing air, there are other fish that do this, whether it's the lungfish or even some species of betta fish that there's very similar to the betta fish you would get at like a fish shop or a pet shop. They're like a sister species, but they do have this primitive lung. But no, they do not live or walk on land. They pretty much just will only swim with the water. Where are they from? So they are originally from Eastern China and North Korea, and even parts of Mongolia. But even in Asia, they have been introduced and spread purposefully, in some cases, into like Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, and then parts of Japan. You can see it in red there on your map. What do they eat? Primarily when they're young, when they're the fry, they eat zooplankton and insects, and then as they get bigger, they kind of graduate, if you will, to smaller fish, the banded killifish, which is a little tiny fish about the size of your index finger or your pinky, white perch, pumpkin seed, and then in various studies of looking at the stomach contents of these fish, you'll see lots of about a dozen other species, and along with frogs, crayfish, and other crustaceans. So the northern snakehead is an opportunistic feeder. It basically hides in vegetation, and kind of whatever swims in front of it or crosses it, it will attack and eat. And what happens is all these other species that are listed here just happen to live in the same type of environment, which is why they're found there. Spawning. One of the reasons that this species spreads is because it does spawn a lot. It only takes, in some individuals in North America, it only takes a year for them to be sexually mature. Sometimes it could be up to 3 years. And in the literature, it can produce up to 5 times a year. In reality, it's more like 2, maybe 3 times a year when you're looking at the East Coast, particularly in the Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania range. But each spawning event could still be up to 50,000 eggs. Not all of them are viable. But 100,000 eggs a year is still a lot. And that's only for one pair of fish. And then the eggs hatch within a couple of days. And then one of the other unique competitive advantages, to reinforce that point that there is a competitive advantage, is that a lot of fish species lay their eggs and then don't tend to them. The snakehead will actually, both parents will actually circle what is called a fry ball. You can see it here, that orange mass. Those are hundreds of fry. And they'll actually circle them and attack anything that swims by them so they can protect them. So that is very unique to species here on the East Coast. And then one other point to make too is that because these are not native fish, they have not evolved with the other fish here, so they don't have as many of the defense mechanisms that a normal fish does. So a lot of these fry don't have, say, spines in their fins or any sort of poison or anything like that. So they do get picked on a lot, which is one of the reasons why you're not seeing as rapid of a spread, but they do still spread fairly quickly. And then, so you'll see wading birds, and to eat the small ones or other fish. Even adult snakehead will eat some fry. And then the adult snakehead as well will get eaten by birds of prey, such as osprey or eagles. And it's not so much that they're hunting for them, it's just eagles and ospreys eat fish, and that's just happened to be what's on the surface. It's just a part of their diet. So in the US, these are the different populations that are known, mostly in the Potomac River, Rappahannock River, those drainages, the Delaware River. There's a few lakes on Long Island, particularly in Flushing Meadows and in Queens, where there are populations that are established, meaning they are reproducing and they are contained to those waterways. There are populations of this northern snakehead also in the Mississippi rivers. The biologists down there are watching their spread to see where and how fast they're changing. And then unfortunately, there are new populations springing up in other areas as people release them. It is illegal to do so. We'll touch on that later. But they are spreading, and any connected waterway they will spread to as well. Then an important note too is that this is just the northern snakehead. There are other species of snakehead, for instance, down in Florida, particularly in like the Orlando area. There are populations of the bullseye snakehead, and then in Hawaii, there's another species out there. So in the US, what is their timeline here? Well, back in 2002, these fish were caught by, a couple of fish were caught by a fisherman at a lake or at a pond in Crofton, Maryland. And it caught national news. There were headlines, even spawned a couple of made-for-TV movies that I'm sure were just fabulous. Frankenfish and Snakehead Terror. No, I've not watched them yet. I'll probably watch them at some point though. But it spawned lots and lots of headlines. What happened was there was a gentleman in Maryland who purchased them from a live snakehead fish market, which was legal back then, for his sister who was ill. In Chinese culture, they were believed to have medicinal properties. So he purchased them, brought them to her, but by the time they got there, she was already better. And so he just released the fish into the local pond. That was back in 2000. 2 years later, they were actually discovered after the population got large enough that people were catching them. And then the Maryland Fish and Game stepped in to eradicate them from that pond, and it cost about $100,000, not a small sum in 2002, not a small sum today. And they were able to eradicate them, but they popped back up again in the Potomac River in 2004. We're going to focus on the southeast PA side of things because that is where John Heinz is, and that's where Darby Creek is. In 2004, a population was discovered in FDR Park, a place called Meadow Lake. It's the blue dot on the right side. I can highlight it right here. John Heinz is right over here. You've got the Philadelphia airport. And the Pennsylvania Fish and Game basically said there's nothing we can do about it because this waterway was all connected to the Delaware River. And it was an established population, so there was no there was no necessary reason to do any major control efforts right there outside of regular fishing and monitoring and electrofishing. So eventually they left the waterway and headed over here to John Heinz up through Darby Creek and made it here. It was discovered, it was first discovered or at least reported in 2012. Who knows exactly how long that they were here. And since then, we've taken a pretty aggressive approach to try to limit snakehead, particularly in Darby Creek and in our impoundment as well. Now, this map will show you their potential, where they could go from here. So the orange area is, so the black area on the right and right in the center is their known populations right now. The orange area is what is connected. This is the right habitat for them that over time, they will probably spread to these areas. The Delaware River is the part up on the upper right. The rest of that is the Mississippi River for the most part, or the Potomac River. You can see the yellow is connected, but it's for whatever reason is uninhabitable to them. And more importantly, the purple area is their potential new waterway. So if they were introduced to these waterways, chances are they would survive. And we want to prevent that because we don't always know what their effect would be on a new environment. Some of the effects that have been documented, though, either by invasive species or by northern snakehead in particular, are direct predation. Obviously, if you have a top-line predator in an area, it has to eat something, so it is eating things. Like we know the killifish, we know it's eating frogs, we know they're eating other fish species in the area. And what that does is that adds that competition for food resources. That's one less fish, that's one less frog for other species to eat, and it disrupts that natural, the natural food cycle, the food web. There was a study, for the longest time too, there hadn't been documentation that the northern snakehead was affecting fish communities. But these things, since 2002, but these things take time to develop. And last year was the first study that I'm aware of that came out with the bass. There was a study out of Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge in Maryland that documented a 30% reduction in largemouth bass populations, and they also altered the fish communities over the course of a decade. So we might be seeing more of these in the near future. Well, everyone is monitoring them both in the Potomac River and up and down the East Coast. In general, the snakehead will lower the overall biomass, the resources that are available to other species. And then one thing to note too, the difference between a closed versus an open waterway. So an area like an impoundment or a lake or a pond, or particularly a pond, those are closed waterways. These are contained, that outside of a major flooding event, there's no real water transfer in between them. So these species stay. Their effect becomes a lot greater because there aren't as many resources available in these areas, as opposed to an open creek where there's a lot more biomass available. That does not mean that these species, that this northern snakehead is okay in one area but not another. They're still bad and they still have effects everywhere. But the impacts can be a lot worse in a closed waterway like an impoundment. So that brings us to, what is the federal government doing? What are the states doing? What are our laws and policies? Well, the first thing that happened was after the national attention in 2002, the northern or all snakehead species were added to the Lacey Act, which just prohibits the importation or interstate transport of live snakeheads. Each of those words is important because the Lacey Act is just about crossing state lines with live snakeheads. They are listed as injurious because they do injure the environment, or they are likely to, based on research by USGS. Fish and Wildlife in general also has a policy for promoting biological integrity, diversity, and environmental health. BIDA is what we call it. And one of the caveats to that is to prevent the introduction and spread of invasive species. That's something that we really try to handle. And this includes snakehead, but this is all invasive species in general. Anything that could have an environmental or economic harm, we try to prevent the spread of and can contain it as best we can. And then one more to back that up is the refuge management chapter there. about exotic species, their introduction. Again, we don't want the further introduction of exotic species. Now, Pennsylvania in particular, this is taken word for word from the Fish and Boat website down there. It is unlawful to sell or purchase live snakeheads, and is also, importantly, unlawful to possess live snakehead, including if you are fishing and you catch a snakehead and you have it in your hands, that is possession, as far as the law is concerned. You cannot introduce or import them, especially into Pennsylvania waters. Other states have the same prohibitions about reintroducing them into areas where they're not found. Each state law is a little bit different about whether you have to catch and kill the species if you get it, or what. We'll get into that in a second. But if you do catch it, if you do believe that you've caught a snakehead, for the state, they do ask that you call this number and report it. And then as far as refuge-specific regulations, we have our public notice here on the right. Specifically at John Heinz National Wildlife Refuge, we follow the state fishing regulations for northern snakehead, and then add on a little bit on top of that. So there's no limit. It's an invasive species. So of course, you can catch as many as you want. And I know that's the same in New Jersey, and presumably it's the same in every single state. There's also, but at John Heinz, there's no boat fishing. You're not allowed to wade into the water. And then there's a fishing map available on our website of where you can fish. Basically, it is along our impoundment trail, but there are some areas that are closed to fishing. There are public notices where you can't fish as well. And so I encourage you to do your research before you go fishing at John Heinz. But specifically at John Heinz, we prohibit the catch and release of snakehead. If you catch snakehead while fishing on lands and waters at John Heinz, you must either humanely dispatch it yourself, or you can contact refuge staff and we'll do it for you. If you have any issues with this, we encourage you to talk to us, send an email to that address at the bottom, send it to me, or talk to our law enforcement staff as well. So if you are going to fish, wherever you are, how do you fish for them? Well, the time of the year can be important. They do have seasons just like a lot of other, just natural seasons, just like a lot of other fish. Particularly they're active April through September, which is their spawning season. And it kind of peaks in the June, July, August, mainly in July. That's where you really start seeing these fry balls and these fish that are swarming and protecting. And if you look, and they tend to live in shallow water, say 1 to 3 feet, where they'll lie in that thick vegetation and hide. Look for ripples if you're going to fish. One thing to note is that the topwater frog and the chatterbait is what it's called. Those are particularly effective. And I do want to say that if frogs are a lure that works, chances are they're also eating lots and lots of frogs within an impoundment or within another area. So that's something to think about and look at. And then if a fish does strike and you see it, just wait a few seconds before you set the hook, and your success will go up. But if you are going to catch, there are some species that you should be aware of. This is, again, a Pennsylvania Fish and Boat a sign. There are 2 species that are native that you should keep an eye out for. The bowfin has that shorter annual fin that does not have that long one that you can see at the top there. And then this spot. I've got some mounts here that when we get out of the presentation, go to video, I can show you. You'll be able to catch these in Darby Creek. Fish and Boat did a survey back in 2014, electrofishing survey, and we were able to find them, both species in 2014. Burbot tends to be more in the northwest part of the state and Lake Erie area, but it's still something you should be aware of. They'll have the whiskers and the barbels that snakehead just won't. You should also be aware that in Darby Creek and statewide, there's a consumption alert. Darby Creek's particular consumption alert is for PCBs, which are polychlorinated biphenyls, fancy word for its chemical that was used in electrical equipment, transformers, that kind of thing. The PCBs can cause developmental and neurological disorders, particularly for children. So pregnant females obviously should take care if you're going to eat any fish that is consumed, any sport fish. In general, the Pennsylvania recommends that you only eat sport fish once a week statewide. For Darby Creek, it's limited to just once a month. It is not something that you're going to eat a fish and get sick. It's much more like repeated use over many years. You build up these chemicals, and then they will hurt you beyond that. And that's when the effects take effect. People always ask me, what would you do if you were doing it yourself? If you were going to fish and eat something out of Darby Creek. And snakehead are very tasty. I encourage you to eat them. If it's me, I'll probably eat it once a year, but that's more because that's just how much I tend to fish and eat game fish in general. 1 or 2 times a year is what I would do. Definitely do not make it a regular part of your diet, meaning weekly. And then if you are worried about it, obviously you don't have to eat it. But if you do catch a fish at a snakehead at John Heinz, and you can turn it over to Refuge staff. So what are some things to do in the future? Well, once the Refuge reopens, what are some things that you can do? Volunteer. We have an awesome program, the Weed Warriors. I want to thank them for all of their support. I know I've got many messages of people who want to get back out and want to help manage invasive species. If you're interested, shoot me an email. I'll have it at the end. And you can come out. We'll train you up and we'll get everything good. And then you can also fish and report your catch. Again, shoot me an email, call the front office. For any state that you're a part of, Virginia, Maryland, New York, Florida, there are numbers to call about reporting fish, catches, snakehead, do the research, just look for the state organization. And then when it comes to managing invasive species at John Heinz, make sure you're doing it underneath the watch of somebody who is the Refuge staff, either myself or somebody else. Even though they are invasive species, when it comes to federal lands, you can't just go out and do it on your own. You can't go pull garlic mustard or any other species just because it is. You can be fined for doing something like that. And in general, aquatic nuisance species prevention. Again, this is taken from Fish and Wildlife or Fish and Boat Commission's website. Don't release your aquarium pets. You might think you're doing good to them by releasing them into the environment. You don't know if it's going to work. Chances are they're honestly going to perish anyway. So if something happens, there are organizations that'll take care of them. Make sure you do your research. Please do not release aquarium pets or any other live food into the environment, any native body, any body of water. Never dump live fish, for instance, for bait buckets, from one to another, if you have a live well, anything like that. And then in general, if you're gonna leave, say you have a boat and you're in one lake, really inspect it, clean it, drain it, and dry it before you move to another pond or lake. No matter the amount of time, these species can live, especially the aquatic plants, can live a long time attached to a prop, a propeller. And then if you introduce it to or zebra mussels can be tucked away into different parts of a boat. And so we're really trying to prevent their spread. And then the main spread for northern snakehead in new environments is people releasing them into new waterways. So that is illegal in every state, and it is and also if you carry it across state lines, that is also nationally illegal. Again, thank you guys for joining us. Thank you DCVA and Stroud for hosting this webinar. And just want to appreciate you guys taking the time out of your lunch to eat this, to watch this. And if anybody has any questions, I will answer them. I know a few popped in the chat. I'll take a look at those in a second. And if I don't get to them, you can always shoot me an email. But thank you guys for watching this.
Thank you, Garrett. That was an incredible presentation. We really appreciate it. We only have one question so far, and that is about, is it tasty? But I think you already answered that. if I'm correct, you do not recommend people eating fish that are in the Darby Creek, or even in the John Heinz part of Darby Creek. Is that correct?
In general, there is a consumption advisory, and I would limit how much you're going to eat. If you aren't comfortable with that idea, then I would recommend not eating out of it. But I would follow and defer to the state in that sense for what they recommend for how much you can eat. Because of the buildup of where these chemicals will build up, the PCBs, particularly in the skin and the fat. So if you get rid of as much of that as possible, you limit your exposure. Mercury, that is in the meat, so you're gonna eat that anyway. So I would definitely recommend, if it's a mercury consumption advisory, just to really limit how much you're gonna eat. But check with the state and what is for each individual waterway.
All right, great. We have another couple more questions. The next one is, how likely are you to catch one in John Heinz?
I have never fished at John Heinz, but I hear anecdotes from other fishermen that say they catch them. Time of the year is important in that sense. We're heading into that season in about a month through, say, August. That's when your peak activity will pick up in terms of catching them. I can't put a number on it or anything like that. But yeah, just make sure you're following state regulations, that if you do come, there's plenty of resources available on the John Heinz website and at the Fishing Boat Commission website.
All right, do you, this is just a general question that I have before I move on to the other questions. Do you know how far up in the Darby Creek that snakeheads have been found? Like, are they just only in the John Heinz section of the Darby Creek, or have they been seen further up in some of the other tidal areas of our tributaries?
I don't have any data or locations in particular. I just have the one study from Fishing Boat Commission done in 2014, and then any other USGS reports. But anywhere that there is that shallow water in the right temperature range and that dense vegetation, they're likely to inhabit. So they could be as far up as they could anywhere that it meets those habitat thresholds.
All right, great, thank you. Another question is, what are some of the effects that has been seen from the northern snakehead invasion?
In terms of reports or studies, there's a report out of Blackwater Refuge that came out last year that documented a 30% decrease in another top-line predator, which was the largemouth bass, and it altered the fish communities there. It studied the difference between the fish communities from 2007 to 2018. And so that is one of the effects. And then there are many anecdotal stories, if you will, from John Heinz as well, where our frog population within the impoundment, we're seeing results from our Enduring Call surveys that those numbers are decreasing over the last few years. And so that is something that we're monitoring and we're looking forward, and we'll shut up more information in the future about it.
Okay, great, thank you. And one other question, and I'm not really sure of what is meant by this, but is it, did the growth of them decline? I'm assuming, does that mean, oh, okay, you just answered that. Question from Long Island, due to what advantages is the snakehead able to outcompete?
So the snakehead, because it is an obligate air breather, can live in low oxygen environments that other fish might not be able to. So when there's a low dissolved oxygen in different areas, another competitive advantage is when they have those fry balls, that the parents will protect the fry until they're big enough. It gives them that larger advantage that other fish species don't normally provide to their offspring. So they get a jump start on life, put it that way.
Okay.
And the sheer volume.
Yes, and the volume as well. The fact that there are, each time that they spawn, that there could be up to 50,000 eggs. That is a lot of new fry into any environment at any given point.
All right, thank you. So if you do catch it down in the John Heinz area, you recommend just killing it. Do you need to report it also that you caught it?
You don't need to report it, but we definitely would like you to. You can send me an email. You can call the front office and let us know. Information that we would kind of look for is where you caught it, how big is it in terms of length, and if you have a weight, any pictures. That's all information that I can use that we keep track of. But otherwise, that's all the things I can think of. You don't have to report it, but we do encourage you to report it.
So do you think that it's encouraged to report it to John Heinz? Is it also encouraged to, is there like the sufficient boat might also be interested in that information, or would you pass that information on to them?
If it's at John Heinz and you report it, I mean, we'll pass on anything to Fish and Boat that we can along the way. If it's outside of John Heinz water, obviously just call Fish and Boat. But if you're on John Heinz, let us know. We'll periodically update them for any information that we have.
Great, thank you very much. Does anyone else have any other questions?
Are there any other fish that eat them? Depends on the size. The smaller fry will be eaten by any other predator that eats small fish, such as bass. Particularly in terms of other animals that eat them, wading birds will eat the smaller fish, even fish up to 6 or 8 inches, depending on the size of the bird. And then the adults will be eaten by birds of prey, such as osprey or eagles. Anything that would normally eat fish. They're not targeting snakehead, they're just targeting any fish that is on the top water.
And we have another question. Cynthia asks to repeat the suggested bait to catch them and the best location to find them.
I can go back to that. Maybe I can't go back to that slide. There we go. Go back to that slide. Yeah, so top water frog and chatterbait, and then the 4-inch musma tube on a mustad hook there.
And I can tell you that most of the fishermen that we see catching them a lot, they're fishing on those frog lures.
All right, thank you very much. I believe that is any, would you like to add any other information?
The only other thing that I forgot to mention too is that John Heinz, the impoundment is the right habitat and home for the state endangered coastal plain leopard frog. So one of the reasons that we try to manage them, particularly within the impoundment and certainly within Darby Creek, is we want to make sure that this endangered frog has a better chance to survive. And so we're always trying to monitor them and trying to increase their numbers, increase that biodiversity that would be at the John Heinz habitat.
All right, thank you very much, Garrett and Lamar, for joining us. And if there's no other questions, I believe we will this will be the end. We'd like to thank you again for presenting this wonderful opportunity for us to learn about the snakehead and other invasives in our area.
Here's our lovely mount here of the snakehead with the long anal fin, and you can see it does have razor sharp teeth too, so be careful if you do catch one. They will bite a little bit, but it's just like any fish that has teeth, it'll do that.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Garrett.
Thank you guys for being here, and hopefully you learned a little bit of something out of this.
We definitely did. Thank you.